Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining the Nuclear Industry Association's Just How Green is Nuclear webinar, which is part of Net Zero Week, the UK's National Awareness Week on Net Zero, and a whole series of online events happening. This is the third Net Zero Week and our third webinar, so it's good to see so many of you joining this morning. Before we start, can I just remind everybody to keep their microphones turned off. We're also, as you might have just heard, recording the session, so it will be made available on the Net Zero Week website later on today. So if there are things you want to go back and hear again, or other people you think might be interested in some of the points that come out, then that will be available. Thank you also to everybody who sent in questions for the panel. Our aim is to cover all of those if we can, if we have enough time. If there are points that come up during the course of the contributions from the panel or the questions, please use the chat function, and I will do my best to try to cover some of those, or as many of those as we can, in the time that we've got between now and 11:30. So to start with, I'm going to introduce our panel today. I should introduce myself, I suppose. First, I'm Tom Greatrex. I'm Chief Executive of the Nuclear Industry Association, so I'm moderating this morning. But our panel, the experts we have to discuss issues around how green is nuclear. Got a diverse and very knowledgeable panel. First is Dr. Paul Nevitt. Paul is Director of Science and Technology at the National Nuclear Laboratory, leads on NNL's science and technology agenda, including core science, research, innovation, and collaboration. And we also have with us Christina Shefarova, who is the ESG lead for Sizewell C. Previously worked as a climate sector lead for the US Department of Commerce at the US Embassy in London. And prior to that, an associate director at a large engineering firm. And I'm delighted to say also joining us is Zion Light. Zion is a science communicator and environmental activist, and known for environmental advocacy work, founder of the client activism group Emergency Reactor, and author of The Ultimate Guide to Green Parenting. Zion has become a world-leading speaker on clean energy and specifically nuclear, and also lectures on science communication and climate action. So each of our panelists is going to just speak for 5 minutes or so before we get to the questions, and let's hear from them now. So I'll hand over to Paul.
Thank you, Tom. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Real good. Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and it's brilliant to be here. So as Tom said, I'm Science and Technology Director at the UK's National Nuclear Laboratory, but wider than that, I'm a father of 2 young children that are pushing me to the limit, one potty training at the moment. I'm a vegan who cares about the environment and the role of science and technology to leave this planet better than we inhabited it. So, but in my role at the lab, I'm the basis of underpinning some of the assumptions we make around nuclear technology and providing that data analysis. But I'm going to run through a few of the kind of non-nuclear organisations in particular and their assessment of nuclear and how green is that. So go to the next slide, if we can. So as I always like to start with a definition, so we all know where we're starting when we talk about what we mean by green energy. And this comes from the Cambridge, energy that can be produced in a way that protects the natural environment. And I'd argue that at the moment, the biggest existential threat to that natural environment is the impact of climate change and CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. So if we take it in from that perspective and that element, if we go to the next slide, I'd like to quote where possible Sir David Mackay, the ex-Chief Scientific Advisor to Government, and this publication and book, which I often reference and I would encourage others to use. But when we look at the climate problem and challenge, you look at over 70% of the CO2 and greenhouse emissions comes from energy generation. So I argue that it's an energy problem, and hopefully we can agree that the impact is from fossil generation, and this quote to assume that we can be motivated to get off fossil fuels. If we go to the next slide, then see, well, where are we in terms of the situation around climate, and this is the IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report this year, which hopefully you heard in the news, but broadly 3 conclusions of a very big report. But human activities unequivocally cause global warming. We're already seeing the effects of that in weather climate, and we are reaching or have passed some of those tipping points, and we need rapid and deep CO2 and greenhouse gas emission reductions. So that's clear. The 2 charts show that the one on the left shows that the red piece shows the current policies, and we're way off track in terms of limiting to 1.5 or 2 degrees, which should avoid the worst of the impacts. And the chart on the right says that within the next 27 years, we need to have removed around 40 billion tonnes of annual CO2 emissions, which is a lot, and it's a big challenge, but we need a plan that adds up to deliver that. And how are we going to do that, and what's the role of technology? But you know, one of the charts that jumps out as a father to a 3-year-old is this one, is the the extent to which the impact on current and future generations will experience that world. So if you look at the box I've highlighted, that born in 2020, when my son turns 30 in 2050, if we've not done anything about the impending issue, the world in which he inherits will be somewhat challenging, to say the least, which drives me to look at the solutions and what we mean by green energy. If we go to the next slide. So what's the IPCC saying in terms of the solution? So this is the report on mitigation, routes to mitigation in terms of climate. And again, I won't go into detail of the report, it's a huge report, but just to highlight that from the IPCC point of view, nuclear is part of the solution, is part of the scenarios and the pathways. So from the IPCC position, I would say that they would equate nuclear to be green, and we'll mention in a little bit the life cycle emissions and the kind of nature of which that's assessed. But in all of the scenarios to achieve the decarbonisation and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, nuclear is part of that solution. If you go to the next slide. In addition, the International Energy Agency published this just last year, noting that the journey away from unabated fossil fuels without nuclear will be slower and less secure, and essentially concluding that achieving net zero globally will be harder without nuclear. And again, part of all of the net zero scenarios from the IEA include nuclear, and as I suspect in terms of whether it's green or not, from an IEA perspective, nuclear is part of that solution. You go to the next slide. So what we're doing in the UK, we know nuclear is part of future policy, but in terms of green finance, this was published in March 23 from UK government, and just pull out the box from there in terms of the green credentials highlighting from UK government. Highlight a number of things, but I just highlight the chart that I pulled out in terms of from a nuclear perspective and the environmental impact that on a number of categories, nuclear is either lower or comparable to renewables. We can talk about some of those in more depth. And in the case where they are slightly higher, there are mitigations available in terms of the regulation around water use and ionizing radiation. The reference within that references a report from 2022 from the UN Economic Commission for Europe. And if you go to the next slide, just to talk in a little bit of data. So from a national lab point of view, we want to be underpinned by data and analysis and numbers. So these may be difficult to see, but this is the report that is referenced, and you can go into some of the data there, but without going into detail, what you will see, so rather than me just saying that they are equivalent or lower than renewable and other technologies, you can see there the nuclear numbers for impact on health, ecosystem, and land use are lower or equivalent to renewable technologies. And just pointing to the quote at the top, where their assessment was nuclear energy is an indispensable tool for achieving the global sustainable development agenda. So if we go to the next slide, And just to sum up, I would say that it's not now a perspective just from, there may be a perspective for people who say, it's nuclear says nuclear is green. It's not nuclear saying nuclear is green. The international agencies say nuclear is green. And just to finish on the next slide, and I would say this from the lab, and just to quote again, some things from David Mackay, I believe we need to ensure that the numbers add up. We can get passionate about different technologies, but ultimately we need a plan that adds up to deliver the energy and the decarbonisation. Once we've got plans that actually add up, then you can decide between them. But I think that's important that we come from a position of understanding the data. So that's me. I'll hand back to Tom, but hopefully that gives a perspective on nuclear and green.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Paul, I'm going to hand over now to Christina.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Paul. You actually covered some of the things I wanted to mention, which is good because I can have a lot shorter introduction. So I've joined the nuclear sector in Sizewell C over a year ago, and all my career I worked in sustainability. And I thought I'm joining large infrastructure construction project because that's where I can say confidently I know something about how to reducing environmental and sustainability impact of large infrastructure projects. And that's what I thought will be the biggest challenge for Sizewell C. However, I spent over a year looking into just how green is nuclear. And I realized that the biggest challenge we have, I think, as an industry is communicating this and answering this question. I've realized that there's a lot to do, a lot we can do during the construction stage. But in general, nuclear sector takes so many of the ESG boxes. I think I should say ESG, environmental, social, and governance. That's basically my job. So I'll tell you a little bit about Sizewell C. So Sizewell C is a new nuclear power station to be built in Suffolk. It will supply power to 6 million homes, 3.2 gigawatt. It's a twin reactor, and it is a replica of another large-scale nuclear power station being built in Somerset, Hinkley Point C. I have some other numbers, particularly on the social side. So it's a large infrastructure project. So apart from environmental benefits, long-term environmental benefits, this is also investment in the UK and in the UK economy, particularly in Suffolk, which is a fairly deprived area. And so we will create new jobs, support 70,000 UK jobs, create 1,500 apprenticeships. And I'm fairly confident in these numbers, particularly thanks to Hinkley Point C, that is already I think it's about 5-6 years in construction. So we can see that actually these benefits are materializing. I think the last thing I mentioned, so Paul already talked about the small land use of nuclear. So particularly operational one is really, really small compared to solar or wind. But what is important is that the construction footprint is slightly larger, still smaller than solar or wind would be needed, but it's larger than the operational footprint of the nuclear power station. And in Suffolk, where we're building Sizewell C, it is area of very sensitive environmental area. We are neighbors to RSPB, Mintzmere, and we have some other important environmental sites nearby. And we do, as part of our construction, we will take a very small part of land that is actually our estate, but we looked after it so well over the years that it obtained SSSI status, which means site of special scientific interest. It's very small, but even before we got planning permission as Sizewell, we've started to create not only compensation, but actually enhancing some of the other area. And I have a little video. Let's see if it's going to work about, because if I talk about this, it doesn't give it justice. Okay, please. think normally there is a nice music in the background, but you just imagine. So thank you. So as you can see, it's very green around and by a low carbon footprint, as Paul was talking about, low carbon footprints, climate change being threat for the natural environment and the nature. We've carried out life cycle assessment that put size of about 5.5 gram of CO2 per kilowatt hour generated, which for your information is less than, for example, wind or solar. So wind, we have about 12, solar 48, and let's don't talk about gas or coal today. So with that, I will close and pass back to Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Zion now. Zion hasn't got slides, but I think he's going to make a few introductory remarks, and then we'll go on to the questions that have been submitted. Zion.
Great, thanks, Tom. So you've already had a little bit of an introduction about me, but I'll just quickly run over the perspective I'm coming from. So I'm not here specifically to answer technical questions because you have these experts already on the panel. I want to talk a little bit about the social license of being able to build nuclear energy, because I, as Tom already said, have a long history as an environmental activist, and I used to be on the other side. I used to protest fossil fuels and I used to protest nuclear energy. And over time, I changed my mind. I realized that I was completely wrong. Basic reason for that is because, yes, it is clean, it is green. And many of us environmentalists got that wrong in protesting it when we should have been focusing our efforts on a clean energy transition. And a lot of people are now realizing this. That's been a hard-won battle that hasn't happened by accident. There's been a lot of us grassroots activists making arguments in all around the world. And that's helped to shift the public perception in a lot of countries, not everywhere. In a lot of countries, it's helped to shift the perspective in favor of nuclear energy, which to me is one of the most important things, because we can know all these facts that, you know, it has a small land footprint, it produces zero emissions, you know, it's clean, we need it to decarbonize. The international consensus is that it's needed to decarbonize. But if people don't accept that, then they will do everything they can to stop power plants being built. So my efforts have been on communicating with, I wouldn't say with the anti-groups necessarily, because I think a lot of those people can't be convinced, but pretty much everyone else in the middle who has been influenced by their messaging and activism for decades and have fallen for misinformation. My work is in engaging those groups, doing a lot of public engagement with those groups, and just having conversations about nuclear energy, because often what I find is all they've heard is something bad. They've, you know, and the industry, you know, I always say the industry, I know a lot of activists will blame the industry and say they should do more communication, but I think, yes, you know, it's always good to do more effective communication, but on the other hand, people don't trust the industry. So coming from the voice of someone like me who, you know, I have the receipts for my activism. I was arrested 15 years ago for protesting coal down at Kingsnorth. Police treated us horrendously. You know, I've shut down tar sands banks that were investing in tar sands. I've done a lot of this stuff for a long time. I wrote a book on how to live with a low carbon footprint, because I'd fallen for this idea that energy use is bad, that we should try not to use energy. And yes, I still agree that we shouldn't waste energy. No, but actually in my experience, most people aren't, especially we think now it's expensive to waste energy. Most people aren't, and our energy needs are still growing. So I've come to a very different perspective, not just on nuclear, but on the role of energy in society. And yeah, my focus has become much more on dispelling this information, which I think is not just something that's applicable to nuclear, but across the board to many different scientific discoveries and technologies. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you very much indeed, Zion. So we've got some people from different perspectives and able to answer some of the questions. So thank you again to people who submitted questions. As I said at the start, if you've got points provoked by what people have said so far or what they might say in response, please try and use the chat function. If I can fit those in as well between now and 11:30, we will do. But for the questions that were submitted by people, including some who are on the call, we'll start with those. I want to ask you first, Paul, a couple of points. One of the things which, and it comes up reasonably frequently, is that we've got to obviously mine uranium, use a lot of concrete and steel in construction on nuclear power plants, and what effect does that have on the green credentials of nuclear? Does it soak up money that we could be using for alternative sources and using those energy intensive activity as part of developing plant and building them?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Tom. And just to build on what Zion was saying, I think communication of this is really important. But we have to work on the facts and the numbers. And the really good thing about nuclear is the energy density. The energy density of uranium is about 2 million times higher than the equivalent oil and coal, which means, what does that mean? It means your demand on the resources that you're mining and needing is less. And again, just to quote others, in terms of the critical mineral demand for nuclear as opposed to other energy sources, it's much lower in terms of that, which means that although yes, we do have to mine uranium, the demand on that is much less than equivalent. Having said that, we must ensure that the highest standards in terms of mining and look to reduce them where we can. Again, concrete and steel relative to other, in terms of nuclear, is energy is much less than offshore renewable, offshore wind, solar. The numbers are much less in terms of that demand. So the second part of the question, I know you mentioned about soaking up money of alternative sources. I'm not sure totally in terms of the meaning of that question, but in essence, as I say, all of the questions around how we solve the energy and the climate is around risks, benefits, and alternatives, and how we manage those in terms of going forward. In all of the assessments that have been done, and many of those that I mentioned in terms of the scenarios to deliver in the future we need, have demonstrated that the scenarios that including nuclear as part of those scenarios are the lowest cost options going forward, and that's why they're included in those scenarios. So I don't think it's a case of something taking money from somewhere else. We need an overall plan to deliver that. And just to reiterate, the life cycle emissions numbers that we have been quoting, the 5 to 12 numbers for nuclear, again, it's all relative, but they include the emissions associated with mining, with concrete, with steel, and broadly on the 5 to 10 for nuclear, I think 1 or less than 1 is about the associated with steel and concrete and mining. So it's on that kind of order of magnitude in relative. And just to put some numbers, Christina mentioned offshore wind is around 12, solar is around 48 according to IPCC, and you're up above the hundreds in terms of coal and oil in terms of life cycle emissions, in terms of just putting some numbers in context.
Great, thank you.
Can I just come in, because there is also a related question in the chat I noticed. So it's particularly for Sizewell. So yes, the life cycle assessment actually including everything, as Paul mentioned, the 5.5 grams CO2 emissions. We didn't include, I don't quote the number that we have for, that includes also downstream emissions, but it's because solar and wind and everyone else doesn't include it neither, but we have calculated it, and you can actually Google it and find a life cycle assessment for Sizewell C and for Hinkley Point C. They're very similar and they're very detailed. So they will tell you exactly, and they've been both third-party verified. So we really wanted to be sure that we have the right number.
Right. Thanks, Christina. And Zion, you want to come in on the question about the
I just wanted to make a quick point about mining, which is it's another thing that it's sort of seen as a dirty word, and this especially in environmental circles. But ultimately, you know, there's a phrase some of you might know that I learned from a mining community, which is if it wasn't grown, it was mined. So everything has this footprint, and nuclear does have a low footprint. I mean, I'm sure you can ask these guys if you want the data on that, and to have a look at actually what the resource cost is from the earth. And you know, some wind and solar have a higher footprint. I still wouldn't say that means don't build anything. I think what we have to look at is the phenomenal footprint involved with mining from fossil fuels, and that's the argument here. That's why these are the cleaner options. And actually, the other thing is our kind of objection to mining, same as our objection to nuclear that people have, has often just leads to us outsourcing these costs. So what happens is we don't want nuclear here, so we'll just import coal from over there. We never allow coal on our land, but you know, we're happy for other people to live in these areas where the air pollution is terrible and they get very sick from this air pollution. And it's a similar thing with mining. I went down to Cornwall recently to visit a couple of mining projects there where they're looking for lithium. You know, solar batteries require lithium. And polysilicon from China and all kinds of other things. But the thing that really interested me there was the way they were doing it so sustainably using an existing mine, because Cornwall obviously has a rich history of mining. So it was an existing clay pit, China clay pit, which they've converted because they found that it has lithium there. And the important thing that I took away from that, aside from the fact it's giving local people jobs who are very pro mining jobs anyway, is that they're doing it so sustainably. Like they're really looking at the water impact, the environmental impact, and you won't always get that if you outsource that cost to somewhere else. So so I make two cases for mining. One is when we can do it at home, we should absolutely do it at home. And the other thing is that we shouldn't, you know, we should just make peace with the fact that in order to live lifestyles that are not, you know, in poverty, and to have things like a laptop and a phone, which everybody here I know has, it does require mining. The thing that we should push for is not to reduce that, but to make sure that it's done as sustainably as possible, which is possible. There are many case studies that prove that it's possible.
Right.
Sorry, Tom. Again, such a good question. Just keep going. I would say actually, nuclear, we can reduce the need for mining. That's the thing, that you need mining for us, as Ian said, for all different industries, but for nuclear, because there is spent fuel or some of the types of waste and uranics that's been produced, there are options how to reuse that fuel, how to look at more circular economy in terms of fuel. So there is a potential, and we need to start looking into it, because although we have to live with mining, there will always be mining. If we could reduce that, it is still, I think our study showed it was about 30% of the carbon emissions. So it's something to look into in more detail, and lots of people do, including Sizewell.
Yep, great. Thank you very much. Christine, I'm going to stay with you, just change tack slightly, just a couple of questions we've had. And I think your sort of, your video, albeit without any nice music behind it, sort of gave a flavour of this, but just about how nuclear projects affect their surrounding environments. You want to say a few words on that, as somebody involved in a project?
So I think I will just summarize what's been said, because the fact that we need a lot less land, the fact that we are saving carbon emissions, so hopefully helping to achieve net zero and preventing the significant impacts of climate change that we saw on Paul's slides. We're helping the nature, but because of the area where we're building in Sizewell, we have quite a large estate that once we finish the construction, will not use for anything else. So why not to increase the biodiversity? And particularly in our project, we've pledged to increase the biodiversity of the local site and the surrounding area by 19%. There is a methodology how you calculate it depending on different species, because we believe this is improved natural environment has so many benefits. Apart from we don't need to cool as much if we have more trees. we know that people in the local area really appreciate everything that's been done, because now they have areas that they can go and walk, and we can interconnect places in Suffolk to go to the seaside through some wonderful walks. So I think nuclear industry is quite ideal for supporting the natural environment.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask this one as well, Christine. It's just one that's in the chat that's sort of related, but just about construction techniques on site. I think the question, I'm just finding from Rebecca Pickering, about low carbon construction techniques, and whether that's something that can help to reduce the impact further, and how far that's something that's being looked at in relation to Sizewell. And I suppose if anyone else wants to come in more generally.
Yeah, I think this is the reason why I first joined, is to look at construction, what we can do, and there's a lot of potential. Again, something which we need to communicate a bit more. So, hydrogen is the buzzword. I'm not sure if we should be using hydrogen for everything that's been out there, but hydrogen generated using nuclear is something which is a really clean source of hydrogen, and it could be used to replace some of the diesel that's used on the construction site. So we are exploring quite a few options, what we could do with this, particularly. We're going to have lots of buses on site. We're going to have really a large workforce. We're going to have about nearly 7,000 strong workforce at peak time, so we need to bus them around. So if we use hydrogen buses, the construction footprint is going to be reduced quite significantly. The same goes for machinery. I didn't mention in my introduction that we are really quite early stages of the project. So we've got government investment decision end of last year. This year we're in what we call capital raise process, and we have financial close hopefully early next year, March, spring next year, which means that's the time when we start construction. So this is now when we're looking at all our options and how to zoom in further on those construction activities with high carbon footprint.
Okay, thank you. Paul, is there anything you wanted to add on that point about in that sort of a slightly wider view on climate-friendly construction techniques?
I think from my perspective, I think what we've got to remember is that as a wider sector and kind of nationally and internationally, those sectors will be decarbonising as well. And the benefit to take from that for nuclear is no different to any other project or programme of large infrastructure. So the drive to drive out carbon emissions from our infrastructure as the overall will be there. And as I say, nuclear is a large infrastructure project, and we should be using best in class methods to do that. And I'm sure the folks at Southwest and Christina will be doing that, and the follow-on project should ensure that they do that. And we're no different as a set to ensure that we are looking at that. One of the things, in the future, we need to be much more integrated in the way we approach the energy system as a whole, say not project by project, but looking at how we optimize projects between not just nuclear but other energy and the production of industry going forward. There's a potential for nuclear to decarbonize those industries, to produce those materials with lower carbon that then feed the nuclear plants going forward. So that integrated view going forward, say, as I say, a number of the emissions from the life cycle emissions of nuclear will be driven down because those industries will be driving down those emissions as well.
Okay, thank you. Paul, I'll change tack slightly, but stick with you. And the question, there's a couple that are in the chat that have come into this area as well, but one that was submitted was about the SMRs and AMRs and whether they're the question was whether they're a greener option compared to a full nuclear power plant. I think what that means is SMR, AMR compared to larger scale gigawatt as with Sizewell, Hinkley, etc. So
are SMRs and AMRs greener than gigawatt plant? I would say, in short, the answer is kind of no. Nuclear is green, and the plant is, from my perspective. SMRs and AMRs are being designed to either target different markets, different applications going forward, rather than necessarily targeting being greener. As Christina says, as a sector as a whole, we'll be looking to drive out emissions across the whole, and that will apply to all technologies. Just to be clear, why the advantage over why you would pick SMR over large gigawatt, a number of potential advantages in different applications. You know, lower overall capital cost makes it more accessible to different private investor. You run the single billions as opposed to 20 billion, say, potential to site in different locations, closer to industry for different applications. So it's about the products we're supplying with those different reactors. In terms of AMRs, the advanced non-light water, potential to go to higher temperatures, allow us to produce different products potentially, with regard to decarbonisation of industry. And longer term, as Christina kind of pointed out, there's the potential for some of those advanced systems moving towards fast breeding systems or fast reactors or others, to be able to look at the fuel cycle and optimize the fuel cycle, which ultimately decreases the demand on the available uranium reserves, which over a longer term period may well take some of the carbon emissions out later. But the reason to go for those technologies at the moment, and why we're looking, isn't a fact of being greener than larger technologies. It's about the different applications. And when we look at the overall challenge to hit net zero, decarbonising not only electricity, but industry and wider, the application of nuclear beyond electricity in particular is something that we need to push while increasing to decarbonise electricity. So I hope that helps to clarify.
Yeah, great, thank you. I'm trying to monitor the stuff that's going on the chat as well, so apologies, I won't be able to get to all of it. Just there's a point here, Christina, from Matthew Lineker about, I'm not sure he's completely understood what you said, so I'll give you the chance to respond to it, just about, well, what he says is that, does it not contribute to the lack of trust that some have to claim that nuclear carbon footprint is lower than renewables, while also admitting you don't count downstream emissions? And his interpretation of that is claiming a victory before the race is over, undermining the communication approach. Do you want to just say again what you said about the studies, because I'm not sure that that point was necessarily picked up.
Right. So I'd say we included downstream in our study. So we have the overall emissions, and you can look it up, and you can look at everything that we included. Now, what I said would be unfair, would be comparing, if we say nuclear including downstream compared to solar without downstream. So that's what I said. So yeah, because downstream emissions are going to be same for all technologies. That's why when I quote the 5.5 comparing to 1248 to 300, 400, that's what I mentioned. But we did calculate the downstream emissions. They are significant. They're out of our control. It's national grid, but there's something that needs to be looked at, and we completely transparent about this.
Okay,
yeah, I guess just to clarify that, the numbers for Hinkley Point and the 5 is without that transmission. When we say downstream, I think hopefully people don't think downstream means the kind of waste management and decommissioning. That's already included in the 5. The transmission is the grid. So and as I say, it moves from 5 to Hinkley Point to 10 when you include the transmission and distribution, which, as Christina says, is relevant to all others and includes things like the SF6 and other things in terms of those gases associated with electricity production from the grid, but is associated with all technologies, say. But still including that, it's 10, which is equivalent or lower. And again, just to reiterate Zian's point, much lower than the hundreds we associate with fossil generation. So we're talking in the kind of error bars as associated with hundreds of grams of carbon from fossil, which I think is the key to remove.
And I think the waste is really good point, because yeah, it is all included, and that's why I think, again, another message that doesn't come clearly out of the nuclear industry is actually it's the only energy generation industry that looks after its waste. We actually have to, and decommissioning. So we have to have a plan, waste management plan. We have to have the financing ready for decommissioning. So we have to do that ahead of even starting the construction. Whereas when you look at other industry, you look at for example, transport and electric cars. Now you're talking about batteries. You would go and think about what we do with all the batteries after, how do we recycle? It's really expensive. I would say look at the nuclear sector, which needs to include the cost of managing waste and decommissioning. And that's why we also included in our carbon emissions. I kind of swayed through, but it's really the responsibility for the whole life cycle is something that many other industries could learn from nuclear industry.
Great, thanks. I'll probably get onto waste in a little bit, but I wanted to go on to a slightly different area. I suppose a more sort of a bigger point or bigger picture point to use it on. Just you hear sometimes one of the questions that's been asked about, isn't nuclear energy just too expensive compared to renewables? And a sort of a second part of that question that came in was whether we can solve global warming with just renewables, i.e. is nuclear too expensive and irrelevant, as we quite often hear some people say.
Yeah, so I think this does feed into the last the last question. So I want to respond to that, because I think there's a misunderstanding here where from Matthew's comment, that pointing out that the lifestyle assessment of nuclear shows that it has a small or the smallest carbon footprint that's just a fact. That's not anybody dunking on renewables, but it's become unfortunate that it's become like a fight between renewables and nuclear, and it's just clean energy fighting clean energy, and I see no reason for it. But the reason that those numbers come out that way is because of how long these things last. So you think a wind farm or a solar farm may last around 25 years and then need to be replaced, and a nuclear power plant can last over 60 years, as you see, for example, in Belgium now, where they're extending that lifestyle out. So this is one of the things that isn't costed when you look at kind of the standard LCOE, if anyone knows what that is, levelized cost of energy measurement for what energy costs. It's kind of a banker's number that might be useful to investors, but people use that to also come up with their own thoughts on what cost is, but actually it's not very comprehensive. It doesn't look at the fact that the power plants run for such a long time. It doesn't look at, in comparing nuclear with renewables, it doesn't look at the backup or the base load needed for the renewables, wind and solar, when it's not windy and sunny. That's fine that they need that, but it should be costed in if you're being honest about what does energy cost. Now, there's too much to go into around cost on this. I actually wrote a really long piece on this on my Substack. That's not me just promoting my Substack, it's all free. But I wrote it because it's such a complicated issue. And if you go to my Substack is just Xeon Lights. If you go and look at the piece called What About the Cost, all of the references to the data are in there. So you can have a good look and you can see all of the things that are omitted from the LCOE assessment and the actual way that we should be looking at cost. But essentially, the cost is still lower than what we're spending on fossil fuels, although you can say, yeah, sure, it's cheap to burn coal, and that's why a lot of developed countries are now burning coal. Yeah, sure. But the cost to human life is really great. I mean, that we know that just from the millions of deaths from air pollution from fossil fuels before we talk about global heating. Can we solve global warming without nuclear energy? Absolutely not. We've seen this in the International Scientific Consensus. We've seen it in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the 1.5 warming report that came out in 2018. This report has a 99% scientific consensus. That's actually a really high level of agreement among scientists who, if any of you are from that background, should know how much they argue over nuances. That's, that report is undeniable that we are causing this problem. We need to solve it. The report also has a section on mitigation by Working Group 3, and they look at decarbonisation scenarios and they provide 4, and all of them require a combination of renewables and nuclear to decarbonise. That is simple fact. If you're arguing with that, there's nothing more I can say to you. That's the data. I've got lots of it on my Substack, so you can have a look because I can't just put lots in the chat, but I have put one in the chat from the UNECE, and that's got a source on it if you want to go and have a look at the actual construction requirements required for nuclear. That's the only reason any of us are saying that they're lower than renewables. It's not to dunk on renewables, it's simply because it's a fact. And I think we should be careful about confusing numbers and scientific consensus with opinion, because as far as I'm concerned, everybody here is talking about numbers and just trying to communicate them as best as possible.
Great, thank you. Paul or Christina, is there anything you wanted to add on that? While I want to go to you.
Yeah, if I can, just to reiterate the point on system costs being the important one, and just to bring you back to kind of the UK perspective, we completed some work a year ago with the Energy Systems Catapult and find that all of the pathways to delivering net zero, you can do it with nuclear, but it is much riskier, much more expensive in terms of that. When I say riskier, you need to be reliant upon other technologies. If you take one of the technologies out, you need to be reliant on others, and some of those aren't around as yet, which are 99+ capture rates for carbon capture, direct air capture working, and including behavioural change. But with nuclear it provides a lower cost route to on a system level route to that. And just to create some numbers, in the absence of nuclear in a full system assessment to net zero, your grid is almost twice the size of when you include nuclear at a deployment, which increases the cost and complexity of delivering the system. So again, I'm not here to say one over the other, whatever, but I just reiterate that we do need a plan that adds up. As David McGay says, we need energy, at a level that doesn't have carbon emissions at net zero. Again, from my point of view, in the work we've done with the Energy Systems Catapult, it's quite clear that the most cost-effective system and the route to go to net zero includes nuclear across large, small, advanced, and across electricity and into industrial heat as well, in terms of the applications and wider. And it just takes a lot more pressure off some of those technologies that we still need, but it puts less pressure on the negative emission technologies, for example. Reaching net zero is not easy. It is not easy. And if you take out one of the tools, it becomes very, very hard. And anyone that's looked at the whole system analysis, and that's why when Zin says the IPCC, the IEA and others, if you take it out, it's incredibly hard. So that's why they're in the scenarios. And just to quote on a number, the IEA report said, without additional nuclear, so keeping what we've got, but without adding any more, would add an additional 1.6 trillion investment needed in other technologies to meet that. So it will be more complex if you roll out the technology.
I want to just quickly make a point there that I think actually it is difficult to decarbonize, but in terms of energy, I think it is actually easy. We know exactly what works. We've got the case study of France and what they did in the 1980s. They built 58 reactors, they decarbonized and have a clean energy mix ever since. Was it cheap to do? The upfront cost didn't look cheap, but it has worked out to be very cheap for them. Before the energy crisis, they had the cheapest electricity in Europe for the consumer. Look at the United Arab Emirates. They had absolutely no nuclear expertise or industry. In under 10 years, they've built 4 reactors. The 4th one is about to come online. It's 94% operational. In under 10 years, they have completely gone from nothing to 4 reactors, 1 power plant, it's called Baraka Power Plant. And that's providing 25% of the electricity needs for the population of the UAE, which is 9 million people. And they're now planning to build more because they've seen that this model of construction has worked. A lot of the slowness and the problems and the complexities come from, I think, a history of people protesting and making regulations over the top and creating all these issues around nuclear. But actually, the technology itself is quite quick and easy to deploy, and it is cost effective. As I explained earlier, if you look over the life cycle, and also, because it doesn't need any backup. Once you've built it, that's it. You've got a system that works and produces no emissions for the next at least 60 years.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to change tack again slightly. We'll come to you, Christine. Just a couple of questions we've had about ESG and UK. There's an announcement from the government that nuclear will be minded to include nuclear as a green technology in the UK green taxonomy. Could you maybe just explain to people a little bit about what the UK green taxonomy is, why nuclear would be included, and maybe to say a little bit more about ESG and the impact and effect of ESG ratings for investment have in relation to nuclear projects and nuclear technology?
So Yeah, absolutely. So there, I actually, on the previous question, I just want to say I agree wholeheartedly what's been said. And there is actually a game. I think EDF has a game where you can keep the lights on in the UK and choosing your own energy mix, how to get to net zero with associated costs, and really, really hard to do. I can't find that link, but if you manage to find it, just have a play and then we'll confirm everything that Paul and Zion has mentioned. So back to ESG and ESG ratings. I start with, so we are looking for private investors. There is quite a lot of innovation going on in terms of size of how it's going to be financed. That's why I think the communication is very important as well, because we now realize we need private investment starting to flow into the nuclear sector to be able to deploy and build as quickly as possible. So we are, fortunately, we have the government backing, but we are also looking for private investors. And as such, lots of investors now really conscious about what's happening around the world, and there are many funds that are green, and in green finance it's a hot topic. You have several ESG rating agencies that give either rating to companies without them providing any information, so they can do ESG rating on how green is a project based on publicly available information. Some of them you would submit information. They're different. They're not really regulated. The HMT or the Treasury had a consultation on ESG rating that closed actually last week of whether it should be regulated or not, to give some transparency into the different methodologies being used, because some ESG rating agency will tell you that your nuclear is green technology or has a shade of green. Some others will tell you, no, it's not a sustainable investment. So because of because it's not regulated, and because there are not transparent methodologies, the government decided it might be a good idea to think about regulating it. Well, let's see where this goes. Now, in terms of taxonomy, so there is, the EU had their own green taxonomy. So again, consistent way how to say what is green finance, what is not, just standardizing approach. And nuclear has been included in the EU sustainable taxonomy last year as a transitional technology, and the UK announced that within the UK, because now being outside of the European Union, we have our own, will be again classed as sustainable financial product, basically. Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. I'm conscious of time, so I've got a couple more questions I wanted to try to cover. I'm going to do one directed towards Paul and one to Zion, and then that'll probably use up the time we've got left. There's a couple of questions that come in the chat, and also one that we had submitted, Paul, about nuclear and other energy transfer methods. Can we utilise waste heat removal for hydrogen production, other opportunities to further support low carbon energy routes? I think Ashok Kumar has asked a similar question in the chat as well. Do you want to say a few words about that? Because we've mostly been talking about electricity, I think, today, really.
Yeah. So at the heart, nuclear provides heat. We currently convert that to electricity mainly to use it to power, and electrification will be the key route to decarbonisation. But there are other routes that we need to decarbonise, and the energy that's produced from nuclear can be used for other means. We can store it for storage, so in terms of being ready. Because again, the way to optimize nuclear is to run it all the time. You got to run it all the time. You can use that in terms of storage, so it's available to use off grid. You can use it directly into industry. For industry, as industry are looking to decarbonize and move away from fossil, a number of industries need heat. Much of that is below 500 degrees C. Actually, you don't need significant heat, but they do need heat rather than electricity. So there's an opportunity to do that. And the other big one, and we've talked about hydrogen, say just on hydrogen, you can use the direct heat to improve the efficiency of the electrolyzers. So you'll see recently a Rolls-Royce SMR report, and others have shown that you can, I think it's about efficiency increase about 50% if you just take some of the heat to improve the electrolysis. But you can also, with the higher temperature reactors, produce hydrogen directly through thermochemical water splitting, using the heat to split it. Why is this important? Again, maybe some skeptical uses of hydrogen, but one of the key things we've got to look at is the replacement for current aviation fuels and others. You know, drop-in fuels will be absolutely crucial going forward, and synthetic fuel production will need hydrogen, and a way to produce that at the scales that we need sensibly could be through high temperature heat. I guess the other one to note in terms of heat, and has been used historically, and it is currently used, and we could, and it was noted by the Energy Systems Council as something for the UK to consider, because it would take pressure off electricity and hydrogen, is district heating. And we've not really used it in the UK, but the opportunity to do that, because of the pressure on electricity and potential hydrogen, to have that district heat using what is nominally the waste heat from a nuclear plant, which is about 84%, you know, efficient. You can use that heat in district heating, as is used in parts around the world. So I think the key for me, nuclear as other technologies, is optimizing this energy that we produce and being much more integrated in our future energy systems to optimize that use of energy that we produce going forward. And we can do that. So yeah, beyond electricity, because at the moment, although we've got the target to decarbonize our power system by 2035, that only makes up about 20% of the overall energy or carbon emissions in the UK. So we need to look at the rest of it.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just, I know we are nearly there, but can I just quickly add on the, so as we're exploring all these options, plus direct air capture, also a quite unique concept of using process heat for direct air capture. So then nuclear could become truly carbon negative. But the important part about this, all this and the waste heat, is supporting the renewables. So when we have lots of wind and lots of solar, and we might not need all the nuclear power in the future, once we build more of both, we can be starting to use this to generate things like hydrogen, direct air capture, district heating, etc. So that's I wanted to add.
Great, thank you. Look, we've got a couple of minutes, so it may be slightly unfair, but there's a question we have which I did want to put to you, which come from somebody asking, I think you might be best placed to give a view on this, is, given everything we've said and talked about and cited, why is it some countries see nuclear as a green tool and others don't?
I don't think that's unfair to ask you that. So I think, I mean, again, answering a complex question in a few minutes. I think, you know, we're a little bit spoiled. Let's just say that we live in the West. Our lighting works. We have access to heating. We have access to education, healthcare, and we have all of this because we burned a lot of fossil fuels. Now, that obviously had other consequences that weren't good. But it did lift, burning all those fossil fuels did lift us out of poverty. Now we feel guilty and we feel bad about using energy because we've contributed to causing global warming, and we also have contributed to bad air pollution. And that for me is a strong argument to transition to clean energy immediately, to make that decision to do that immediately, instead of pointing at other poorer nations that are now burning fossil fuels and saying, we don't want you burning them. Well, actually, they didn't cause this problem and they also need to escape poverty. And I think that kind of privilege that we have, it can be demonstrated in, sorry to throw this on Germany, but this is a great case study of what's happened in Germany, where they spent over 500 billion euros on Energiewende, which was a plan to shift to 100% renewables. So they wouldn't need any baseload energy. So they closed all their coal-fired power stations and they closed 11 nuclear power plants over about 10 years. And whereas that left them, they now are, as you've probably seen in the news, excavating villages to mine them for coal, and they're burning lignite, which is the dirtiest kind of coal, right? Like, we should not be using this in the developed world at all. There's no moral case for doing this, but that's what they're doing. They have lots of coal, they're going to burn it. They've got very, very dirty energy mix. Why did this happen? Because they put ideology above facts. It's as simple as that. And it's not different to vaccinations, where you've got a lot of people here now arguing against vaccinations that have saved so many millions of lives. Well, in the developing nations, they are crying out to have access to these vaccines so that their kids don't die from completely preventable diseases. So really, you know, I think it's about not understanding how important energy is to our lifestyles, and that we do live high energy lifestyles. That is not a bad thing. The only bad thing is that if it comes from dirty sources, that continues to contribute to the world's problems, and that has the heaviest impact on the poorest communities. And we really need to shift our thinking on that, away from like, oh, I don't want to live near me, whereas that's just a point of privilege, similar to what I said earlier about we're quite happy to import coal. We won't build nuclear power stations next to us, but we're happy to import coal when it comes from Poland, where people are having to live near these power stations, and they're often people of colour in the most marginalised communities, and they cannot afford to move out of those areas. They talk about windows literally covered with soot, kids with respiratory issues, high levels of cancer. These are the things we should actually be caring and worrying about, and this should bring us back on the focus of all clean energy is good, and we need to build as much of it, yes, in our backyard, so that it doesn't happen abroad to other people, and so that we can have good environmental standards. So, you know, I think the reason there's a shift here, again, you know, that we've had a shift here against it, is because we've become very used to having cheap, abundant, easy to access energy, and it fuels our lifestyles, and we have no concept of what it is to live without it. Whereas my parents migrated here in the 70s from the Punjab little village in India where there were rice farmers, didn't know where England was on a map, couldn't speak English, were offered to come here because my granddad was hurt as a prisoner of war in World War II. He fought for the British. Anyway, they were offered to come here, and they left behind their entire culture and their whole family, which is a huge deal in these Indian communities, to get on a little rickety boat to come here to work in, frankly, awful factory jobs their entire lives. They never complained about that. But, you know, back then the standards for health and safety were not very good. But anyway, they did that because they understood. They came from a village where they didn't have access to electricity, they didn't have that energy, and they understood that the way that energy poverty is energy poverty, and to escape that, they need to have access to energy, and that is why they came here. But ultimately, we want people to not have to flee their homes. We want them to have that access at home. We cannot encourage other countries to have that transition to clean energy when we're not doing it. When, you know, Germany's burning coal, when they had 11 nuclear power plants, you know, they shut down clean energy because why? You know, it feeds into Matthew's question, because it's not renewable. But that doesn't mean anything. Biomass is technically renewable, and it's extremely polluting, and we shouldn't be burning wood to create energy. So wrapped up a lot in there. But again, I do have a Substack. If you want much more in-depth answers to these questions, I've covered almost everything we've spoken about here on there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Leon. We've gone slightly over, so thank you, everybody, for sticking with us and for your contribution. I'm sorry we didn't get to every single point that was in the chat, but I hope we've given you some points and some discussion on a range of different aspects around nuclear. Can I just thank Paul, Christina, and Zian for joining us today. As I said before, the recording of this will be on the Net Zero Week website later today if you want to go back, or anything you want to hear again or to point other people to. So thank you very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.